How do we come back to a place of true worship and celebration of Jesus' birth?
The Advent Conspiracy is really this experience of being able to enter into the story of Christmas.
There were moments, and I can remember them distinctly, even in recent years, where I would sense that I was missing it. I would sense that I was missing the wonder, the awe, the worship, the celebration. I was getting sucked into the pace. I was getting sucked into the worry about buying the right gifts, the pressure to buy enough gifts. And invariably at the end of Christmas, there was this letdown, there was this ache, this longing that somehow I had missed it. And that was a part of what really began to fuel this idea of the Advent Conspiracy for us.
It's an attempt to recapture the beauty of Christmas. If we're going to celebrate the birth of Christ, we thought maybe it should be actually about Jesus rather than the things that too often consume us.
We started Advent Conspiracy, and the first year it was this complete experiment. We were kind of going, well, we don't know what's going to happen.
Handful of churches.
Yeah, people might riot. There's just 5 churches.
Yeah.
And then what happened was this overwhelming response. I mean, people going, this changed Christmas for us. Hundreds of thousands of dollars raised. So the next year we thought, well, let's just open it up, see if other churches want to go. We threw up a cheap website, designed for free practically, and figured maybe we get 100 churches, and it just went crazy. We've had well over 1,000 churches show up that first year.
The word conspiracy reminds us that this is an opportunity to push back and to be countercultural. To be honest with you, there's a lot of what happens around the Christmas celebrations each year that really has very little to do with the Christmas narrative and has very little to do with God coming to earth.
My kids got it better than sometimes my wife and I did. We were still tempted to go out and get them some big extravagant gift that they didn't really need, but they got very clearly that Christmas should be about Jesus, and that if this is Jesus' birthday, that it didn't make sense that we were giving all of our gifts to each other and not to Jesus.
You're talking about the most, one of the most theological high points of the scriptures. And we're doing that in the context of people just rushing in chaos to malls, and this whole other narratives going on the side that's actually distracting everybody from the main story. And so as a pastor, you get really frustrated because you're experiencing that chaos too.
We celebrate Christmas by mass consumerism, and I'm as guilty as anybody.
We're so busy ripping and running, trying to figure out how we're going to set up this big day that we forget to spend time with the Lord.
You know, for years I just wanted to go to a desert island for the whole month of December just so I wouldn't have to be around all the consumerism.
Maybe the most surprising thing is that there's nothing that innovative or new about what we're doing. It's just that we drifted so far. I mean, we had moved in a direction that we had almost completely forgotten, lost memory of what we were celebrating. So when we just had a gentle reminder to people that this is about worshiping a baby born into the world that was fully human and fully God, and we ought to worship appropriately, people said, we want to do that.
You know, you're in a weird time when you state the obvious about Scripture and it becomes this huge prophetic imagination that something in your culture is wrong. It's not really that we're leading anything too amazing.
I'm going to go ahead and just check out, and I'll meet you outside the store.
Our hearts are formed by what we worship. Our attitudes, our affections, the things we give our time to, all of our life gets formed by what we worship. And during Christmas, there's really these 2 stories of worship. One is a worship story that entails the purchasing of things, buying stuff that will indicate somehow to the person we give them to that we love them. It's still a love story, but it's a love story that represents a different God, a God of stuff that breaks, disappears. Every year on Black Friday, people get up at 5:30 in the morning. Hundreds and hundreds of people get up and they stand in line for hours and hours to get the best deals on stuff. And some people that's a nightmare for. They never want to go there. And for other people it's fun and they like it. And who doesn't want to save money, right? That's a good use of your cash. And at the same time, we have to be honest with ourselves, like, that's a worship event. People are excited to get there and they give themselves to it, and that's a Christmas worship event. And I think the question that we have been wrestling with and started asking ourselves is that the right worship event for the birth of Christ? The God who comes and gives you salvation and gives you meaning and significance and all these things. But if we're really paying attention, are we going to miss out on that worship event? The worship event that is about Jesus and salvation, because we're so busy cutting coupons for the other worship event. I remember hearing of a man who was shot fighting with another man over a PlayStation 3 for his son. That's a love story. It's a weird love story, but it's truly a love story. And his love was expressed in what he worshiped, getting a game for his son.
Our society has become kind of numb to human relationship, to suffering, to love, because we have so much. And I think it's easy for us to forget about our need for God if we're not hungry, if we're not thirsty, if, everything that we need is right at hand.
And yet there's this other story, and this really is the story that is the church's to tell. It's the story of Jesus Christ coming into the world to bring salvation and a new humanity to all people. That's a story that isn't told with cheap gifts. It's not a story that is told at malls. It's the church's story. It's our story to tell, and we're not telling it very well. And really, the Advent conspiracy is an opportunity and an invitation for us to worship Jesus fully. The God who came through the womb of an unwed teenage mom, that enters the world focused on a cross so that he can save and bring justice to all. That's the God that invites us to worship him, to lay down our handfuls of cheap gifts and raise them up to worship an eternal King.
Ever since I caught the idea of Advent, I've loved it. I've loved the idea that, all right, like in the midst of all this craziness of the season, you want us to be quiet. And in the midst of all of this buying, you want us to focus on this other gift that money couldn't touch.
When you think about the aspect of worshiping Christ fully, there really are these distinct characters within the narrative of Christ's birth. One of the groups of people that got in on worshiping Jesus at the very moment of his birth were these shepherds. The shepherds were really despised people in that culture. They couldn't give testimony in court because their character wasn't sufficient. They were stealing things. They just were seen as people who nobody really trusted. And yet this is the group of people that the angels show up to announce that Christ has been born. I mean, nobody else gets in on it, right? Almost everybody misses it when God actually shows up on earth. But the poor, the despised, these kind of oppressed shepherds, God knew their heart. And he showed up and the angels announced them. Their first response isn't one of questioning or doubt. They go right away to find this baby. And so these shepherds get in on the birth of Christ and they worship fully. They come back praising God. They witness to people. They're the ones telling the story of Christ's birth. It's interesting to me that God would entrust that announcement to them. We really think that there's some kind of socioeconomic stigma when God's deciding who he trusts and who he doesn't trust, but he knows our hearts. On one hand, you have these really poor, despised shepherds. On the other hand, you have these wise men who were people of great means and wealth and some aspect of notoriety. And they show up, and they actually show up to the king, King Herod of that day. I mean, Herod didn't just meet with everybody and anybody, and And yet they stood face to face with this tyrant king. I mean, a king who killed his own family members because his throne was threatened, and they ask him to his face, "Where's the one born king of the Jews?" And when they show up, they lay it all down. Their gold, their frankincense, their myrrh. They come with all their wealth and resources. And God accepts both stories. So all the shepherds have are their mouths, really. They don't have a lot of cash, but they announce to the world. And then these wise men come with their resources, and they announce as well by giving those gifts to Christ. And the question becomes, what are we announcing with our worship? I get so kind of tired of watching the news around Christmas and seeing the big scandal that this store or this mall or whatever it was, they say happy holidays, not Merry Christmas, and we get angry at that. I kind of have to scratch my head and go, is that their story to tell? Or is it our story to tell? Like, are we really, have we abdicated our worship so much that we're expecting the mall to tell the story of Christ? If we worship with our lives, whether we worship the worship of shepherds who show up and announce to the world, or we worship like wise men with all our resource, it's that fullness of worship that tells the better story. And that's a story that can't be diminished to a slogan or a tagline like Happy Holidays or Merry Christmas. That's a story that gets announced to the world that says God has given a son, and that changes everything. One of the questions that I think we naturally ask is, what does this mean for me? How do I worship fully? Is this a matter of more activity, like be busier, go to church more, sing louder? And those are really these reduced pictures of worship. That's pretty much the opposite of what we're saying.
Christmas time, Advent is the hardest time for someone who, frankly, gets a lot of joy out of being out there shopping, gets a lot of joy out of seeing people bustling around with their bags, There are people who are really susceptible to commercials and, the Christmas spirit and all. I'm one of those people. So for me to pull back from that was huge. But what I experienced was that pulling back from that, it was as if there was more room for God. It's the miracle of Advent, that it's almost like God makes a pact with us. If you give me more space during this time, I will come and dwell in you. And for years, I think I knew about that deal, if you will, but didn't really take God up on it. And over the last 2 years, really, because of the Advent conspiracy, I've been able to say, okay, God, you know me, and you know what joy I get out of just being out there, running around, shopping. I'm critical of it, but I'm also deep in it. But if you're saying that we could do this differently, and that if I do this differently, you'll dwell in me richly, I'll take you up on that, God. And God didn't fail.
I think the invitation for us is, what would it look like to take the story of Christ seriously? To lay down our armfuls of presents and chaos, to reduce the amount of time we spend on shopping. What would it look like to then refocus and reimagine what this holiday is all about? What does it look like if as a family we get together and we try to tell this story better? What would it mean for us to take our resources and our time and say, how can our worship of Jesus tell a better story? And it's in that place when we're captured by the beauty and majesty and power of the God who became flesh and dwelt among us, that all the creativity and imagination springs forth with really beautiful ideas that we can't give you. And that has the power to create new possibilities of what worship looks like. Worship that hasn't been reduced to singing or attending something, but a worship that organically and creatively comes out of our hearts and expresses itself in a beautiful display, because the Spirit of God desires that your worship would create a new expression of the kingdom of God that would announce to the world, as the shepherds did and as the wise men did, that God has given us a son and we worship him because he's worthy of our worship. And that shapes how we do life together, and particularly how we celebrate Christmas together as a people.